So my name is Debbie Weaver, and today we're talking about changing vital information on the family tree. And there we go, the scope. What we're going to talk about is vital information on the person page, which involves names, dates, and places, as well as a few other things. And then talk a little bit about programming, also making changes and corrections, and then my soapbox would be standardization. So there's three things that I do on almost every record that I touch or person page that I go to. I want to start with, I check to see that all the sources are tagged, they're attached, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. I also standardize vital and other information fields and places. I also attach and verify every source that comes up as a hint. If it's a good source, I want to make sure that it's attached. And
hey, Debbie, this is Bob Taylor. I'm sorry to interrupt. It sounds like your sound is breaking out or a little soft, maybe a little closer to the microphone.
Let's see if, I'm not sure how to get that to go up. I will try to sit a little bit closer. How's that?
That's already sounding better, yeah.
Okay, I'll try to talk louder here. Okay, so when we talk about vital information, we are talking about name, birth, christening, death, and burial. Those are the things that we do in that first section. But there's also other things like marriage and additional facts, and so we want to touch on those. There are places where you can go to get information. I'm going to put these at the end of the slideshow. White papers at FamilySearch that have specific information, and also on entering names and family trees, so those will come at the end. So we'll start with what's in a name. Names are the first thing that most people look at and things that are most interested in making sure are correct. And so this is from the field of adding a person. There's the first names field. Titles, I don't put titles in because that's not the birth name. But you may need to have a title in the other information section. First names, I'm going to type in the first and middle names, and then the last names, or the last name is the last name of the person, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. And then the suffix field is just information such as junior, senior, or third, and you don't want to put other information there. So there are some additional rules. You want to use the birth name field or birth name in that first vital information field. And you want to use the maiden name for the female. A lot of times people will say, well, I don't know the maiden name. In that case, you're going to leave it blank or empty because you want to be able to find the maiden name. And by having the married name in there is going to cause confusion. And you don't want to type in all caps. In the past, they used cap letters to designate that it was a last name, but because we're using data fields, that last name field designates that as the last name. And don't want to use quotation marks, parentheses, all these other markings in there, although you can use hyphens for last names if there's a hyphenated last name. And then also don't use the word or between names. So those are the basic, most important rules, I think, when you're adding names for information. I always use my husband's second great-grandparents as my poster children for how I learned the importance of putting information in correctly and fully. This is John Peter Hart and Isabella N.C. Higginbotham. And this is a photograph that we have of them that has been passed down through the generations. And you can see it's pretty beat up and worn, but one day I hope to meet them and to thank her for all the help that she is giving me and teaching me how to enter data correctly and why it makes such a big difference. When I first started really getting into genealogy and working on the records, I came across a record for an Isabella N.C. Higginbotham, but she was really a compilation of multiple Isabella N.C. Higginbothams because I naively thought that it was such a unique name that there could only be one. And since then, I have learned that a lot of names are not very unique, or they may be unique, but a lot of people use them. And so I don't think that just because it's unique that that's going to be the only one. And here's an example. This is just 4 of the Isabella Higginbothams in the Florida in the 1800s. And you can see that their births are all within 25, 30 years. They all had the first name of Isabella, and 3 of them had a middle name of Nancy. 3 of them had maiden name of Higginbotham, and the second one, she actually married a Higginbotham. And 2 of them married somebody with the last name of Braddock. And all of them had at least one parent with the last name of Higginbotham, and one of them also had a mother with the name of Braddock. So you can see how easy it is to think that Isabella N.C. Higginbotham might have been a unique name, but in some cases, Isabella N.C. was, Higginbotham was the married name, and in some cases it was the maiden name. So that really, in order to separate all the Isabella N.C. Higginbothams that I came across, I had to make a very clear distinction between what were first names and last names and maiden names and dates, and have that clear in my mind in order to separate them all out. So I'm going to just show you, this is Isabella N.C.'s page, and you can see, go to the details page. When I come to a person's page, I look at the tabs across the top, and it's much like a notebook. If you were to turn it on your side, those would be the tabs. And then below that, you'll have information under each of those sections. In details, you'll find life sketch, vitals, other information, and family members. And you'll notice the little X that is right here. I just realized I have a drawing tool I can use. Those little triangles right there, they all open up. So wherever you see those on FamilySearch, it means that it will open up and give you more information. In this case, I can click on that and it will give us the vital information. And in this case, you can see each of these different fields for the vital information. And beside each one, you can see that there's listed sources. There's an edit button which will allow us to make changes. And so I look at those all as individual details and information. And those 10 sources down here that are you see are represented in the sources up here under the sources tab. And we'll go into that a little bit as well. So notice this a little bit closer up. So next to the vital information of each one, so under name, I show the sources, and then there's a hyperlinked button, name of edit, where I can click on that and open up the editing field. And when I do that, I'm going to be able to see the information that supports her names. And this, so I'm going to make that a little bit bigger. Here you can see that there's one person watching. That's me. I will always be watching Isabella because I put so much work into her. And you can see the other contributors. So there have been 12 contributors who have actually touched or made changes on this record since I created her. And this other field right here is actually for language. So they didn't used to have this, but now they do things in different languages. And that can be helpful if you're working with families in different countries. So Isabella's first names are Isabella N.C. That's anything that comes before the last name. Higginbotham is her last name. And when I created this, because I was trying to separate and make a distinction between all the Isabella N.C.s, I wanted it to be very clear that Isabella N.C. actually married her first cousin, John Peter Hart. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. You can also see any changes that were made to just the name field, and this takes you to the change log, and it'll show you different changes. You know, if it was changed from Isabella Higginbotham to Isabella N.C. Higginbotham, when it was made and who made that change. On the right side here, I can see the sources that support the information, and I can also see where it's tagged at the top. Those are all specifically tagged to the first name. And that first record there that says Isabel Kuklash, I always thought was kind of an interesting thing. So I wanted to go and look at the actual record. And if you look at the actual record, it does look like Isabella's correct. But I can see, and I've seen this actually a lot more since I first started, Higginbotham, I think, was tough for people to write. So, or if they heard it, Higginbotham, they actually typed it Hickabotham. So you can see that's Hickabotham or some variation of it. And so now whenever I look for anything, I also look for that variation in the spelling, just because I know that that's a common mistake or error. But since that time, we now actually can change or edit some of these records. And in this case, you'll see I've edited it. So the title of the field actually now says Isabel Higginbotham, as it was indexed in the record or written in the record, where the old version was Isabel Higginbotham. And on the right side, you can see I've changed it here to Isabella Higginbotham, and here's the edit below as to what it was originally. And so both of those may become searchable in FamilySearch, but I love that they now allow us to the ability to correct some of the information by people who know a little bit more about the family. Let's go on to, I talked about tagging sources. This is really helpful when you're entering information in FamilySearch to make sure that the information or the sources that you attach to a person are linked to the facts that they represent. So under sources, click on that. You can see when you open up a record at the top, showing where it's tagged. And then on the right, you can see which details. So in the census record that I've opened, Isabella, you see that she is tagged for her name, sex, and birth. Those are the facts that are represented in that record. And then they will show up. So when I'm editing information in those fields, I can quickly look over and see the sources that represent those. If they're not tagged, they won't show up in that editing field. Just for an example of why I also take the time to open up records. In this case, here's a on the screen on his person ID page. His name looks completely normal and fine. It looks like there's no sources, of course, but it looks fine until you open it up and you see that William G. Higginbotham is actually all in the last name field and not separated into the first names field. So I have found that it's just worth it to look at each of those. And so I'm going to fix that. I'll put William G. first names, and now it can start to look for records directly in the system. I'm going to talk about databases and standardizing because as somebody I just love behind the scenes things, and I like to know why things work the way they do. And talk about, all of these programs that we use have to be programmed by somebody. They have to take into account all the anomalies, and it's kind of a difficult job that they have. My daughter's a programmer, my husband's a lot of databases, and my other daughter is a librarian. So I'm really acutely aware of the what goes into programming and making things work. So that being said, when I was a kid, I loved matching games. I loved to be able to, I don't know why, this was just my thing, but I loved it. And this is really what FamilySearch and matching records up to people reminds me of, and sometimes it's really simple. This equals that. This looks just like that. A watermelon is just a watermelon. And those are the easy ones, but FamilySearch and working in that program is probably more complicated, like Mahjong, where you may have information such as a date and a place that you're looking at, and then you come across something else, and maybe the dates are different, but the places are the same, so they're not really equal. So what I'm looking for are things that are equal in all things, and it makes it easier to match. And then once I've done all of that, I can go back and start to look for things and evaluate the information that doesn't match just the way I think it should, and update that. So I know that they use criteria to program in how FamilySearch looks for records or duplicates. And so understanding how that works dictates how I enter the information. So let's just say, for example, that there's a point system given for anything that's entered in there. And if something matches exactly, let's say it gives it 2 points, and if it's similar, it's going to get 1 point. And if there's no information, then there would be 0 points. So I can say, let's go ahead and just give you an example of what that looks like and how I discovered this. When you do a search, and here's just an example of a search on Isabella Higginbotham. Over here on the right, I can actually export these results into a spreadsheet. And you can see I just typed in Isabella Incy at the top, Higginbotham, and the birth year of 1854. And I got some results, and it was scored, which is why I came to believe that there was some sort of evaluation or numbering system that said, you know, if it's above this, we'll return this as a hint. And in this case, this is, I believe, a census record for Isabella Incy because it's the 1860 residence of Florida, and it gives her birth date as, her birth year as 1854. Now, if I do an additional search and I added a death year, and I also added John Peter Hart as the spouse, and you'll notice that this score was actually higher on this because there were more things that it could match on. It matched on her name, it matched John Peter Hart, and then it still also brought back the 1860 census, but at a much lower score because there was less information to match against. So however that works, I find it actually very helpful. Now, here's the interesting thing is when it brought back this record, you can see there's actually two dates for a marriage for Isabella Incy Higginbotham and an Isabel Higginbotham to a John Peter Hart. When I was first researching, I thought, wait a minute, what are the chances that an Isabella Higginbotham could marry a John Peter Hart, that there could be two sets of those? And that's when I started to learn that they actually had married twice because they were first cousins. The family were not happy with that. So John and Isabella married. They had one child and then they divorced. And he actually married somebody by the name of Pinky Posey Pravat, which is a name I just love. I think I will use it in every presentation I give. But Pinky Posey Pravat passed away a few years after they were married and had a couple of children. And so John Peter Hart, who was still very much in love with Isabella Incy Higginbotham, went back, and 5 years later they remarried again in 1876. So that accounts for those two records, and I wanted to put those into FamilySearch to make sure that it's very clear and that those records are attached, so they don't get attached to somebody else's separate couple is created. So dates and places are incredibly important in how we put that information in. For example, if you come across a date such as this, 4/5/65, it really can be interpreted as something like April 5th, 1965, or it could be interpreted as May 4th, 1865. And it creates a lot more work if you have to try to figure that out. And in fact, if I'm working in other countries, I need to look up and see when I come across a date like that, well, how do they put their month first or the date first? So you want to eliminate that error by just putting in the information the way that it should be. So the standardized format in FamilySearch, you need to use the full month spelling. However, if you work a lot in Ancestry.com, you're going to see that it's a different spelling. They're going to use the 3-digit month. So when I'm working in Ancestry, I will leave those as 3 digits, but in FamilySearch, I always change it to the full month spelling. So if you do not know the exact or correct date, you can do some things to make it a little bit easier. For example, I always, often, mostly, 95% of the time, I will use the word before a date because I find that that is the most useful. If I use about, I want to be sure because the computer will search when you use the word about within 2 or 3 years, whereas before it can search for anything before a certain date. And sometimes people are like, well, I'm pretty sure it was this, but they might be off by 10 years. And so by putting about, they've eliminated the computer from doing half the work, and then they have to do the work. You can also put in from 1810 to 1820. I, again, would just prefer to put before 1820. That way, I'm not eliminating records because I didn't know something. Use just the full month and the year if you don't know the exact date. And then 29th of February, actually this happened to me just a few days ago where I came across a date and it said it wasn't a standard date. And I went, why? And then I looked at it and it wasn't a leap year. They had put in 29th of February, but it was not a leap year. So now I'm left to decide the year after, I'm not sure. So just check those kinds of things. That doesn't happen very often, but I was surprised it finally came across that. And then some people will put in calculated, which is a standardized way to put that. But again, I don't do that because if I put in a calculated date, it limits my search. I want to put in something that expands the search, and so I use before. And then you'll often come across unknown in the date or dead. Those, because if it's blank, we know it's unknown unless there's an actual date in there and a source to support that. So I want to give you some real life examples of how I use these dates to help me find information in FamilySearch and find more records. So for example, I come across this a lot. In fact, I could do a class on Cornwall England records. I have this family, and I have a father named James and a mother named Anne and a son named William. What I'm looking for is the record. So there's only one record attached to a William. And by the way, these are all made up, but there's a christening date of 3rd of November, 1770 in St. Justin, Penrith. And that's all I know about this family. And there's no dates of anybody else. I don't know how old James is. I don't know how old Anne is, but I've got William here. And what I can do is I can infer how old he is, or infer. I can infer that he was probably born before his christening date. I can infer that his father was probably at least 20 years older than him. And I can infer that his mother was at least 18 years before his birth. And so I will often go in and put in those inferred dates, because then that gives the computer something to search for. I can also infer that because he was christened in 1770 in St. Justin, Penrith, that was likely the residence of the parents. Now, today we're a little bit more mobile, and that may not always be the case, but it was fairly likely that they were living in the area where he was christened. And I can do the same thing for Anne. And now what I've created is this family unit where I have James, who was born before 1750 and was living likely in 1770 in St. Justin, Penrith. Now I've created enough data for FamilySearch to start looking for records for James, that criteria. And in case, and it actually does, I now find that there's a christening record for a Jane Frick just 2 years after the parents' name's the same. And so I'm going to add Jane to the record. Once I do that, I could also go back and add, well, now they're also in St. Justin, Penrith in 1772. And now I'm creating a timeline for this family. So by attaching those sources, FamilySearch starts to make connections and said, well, if you've got 2 kids christened in this parish, we've got a marriage record for James Quicken and Anne here in St. Justin, Penrith. And if I do a little searching and I find out that they're the only James Quick who was married before or about the time of the children's christening, I believe that this is their marriage record. And the great thing about that marriage record is it now gives me a maiden name for Anne of Harris, which is great because I'm starting to build this family. And then furthermore, it's going to start finding all these other records for the other children, and pretty soon I have a whole family put together, and then I can start to move back in another direction. I'll also look for census records and other things that tie the entire family together. But I have been able to put so many families together and really, if you remember, all we started with was the christening date and place. That's all we knew about this family. And by the time we were done, just by adding in some inferred dates and places, we now have a complete family. So here's a more modern example. Again, these dates are made up, but if say I have a family and it's a marriage, I know that John Tilton and Nancy Hart were married about 1840 in Florida. So I do the same thing with them. I'm going to give them an estimated date. I'm going to say John was probably at least 20 years old when he was married, and Nancy was probably at least 18 years. Now this doesn't, even if this is a second marriage for John and he was born much earlier, because I used before, I am not eliminating the fact that he could have been born, say, in 1810 or 1790. Will encompass all of that. And then I can also infer that unless he was illegitimate, that his father's name was Tilton as well, and that he was born before 1800. I can say if this is Nancy's first marriage, that her father's name is probably Hart. Now, if I'm wrong on any of this, I can change it later, but I want to be able to find these records, and I want the computer to do it for me. So I'm going to give them each estimated dates, and with her father 20 years before her estimated birth, I can infer that he was born before 1802. Now, next I find a census record, 1900, which shows a John Tilton married to a Nancy. They were born married about 1840. And that record actually tells me that his birth, I love the 1900 census because it also gives you the month. And it says that he was born in March of 1815. And March of 1815 is before 1820. So that fits my criteria. And that he was born in Jacksonville, Florida, which is consistent with the fact that they were married in Florida. But what it also does is it tells me that his father was probably residing in Jacksonville, Florida at the time that he was born. So I'm going to give him an estimated residence. And it said that his father was born in Georgia. That's great because now I have somebody named Tilton who was born in Georgia before 1800 and has moved to Jacksonville, Florida sometime around 1815. So this I just keep adding these layers of information and pieces, and then FamilySearch just keeps bringing me more records. And I also found in this record that the mother was born in Virginia, and I also now know that Nancy was born in June 1821, so I can adjust her birth year. And she was born in Jacksonville also. And it lists her father's birthplace as New York, mother's birthplace is South Carolina. Those are very specific details that can help isolate and tell me who these people are. So that's what. So I use this all the time. People think I'm a really great researcher, and I'm okay at it. But what I'm really good is putting in information that FamilySearch can search for, and then it returns the records, and then I'm really good at evaluating whether those are the people that I'm looking for. And I do a lot of adoption and DNA work, but I use that too because I'm looking for a lot of missing people, and so I create these lives for people. And the records just keep coming because of that. So this is a great tool to use. So we're going to talk next about places. And my biggest rule is just standardize what is already entered. You might say, well, I don't think that's right. Well, it doesn't matter if it's right. I just want to standardize whatever's there because you're going to get to the correct information more quickly if you standardize what's already entered. And then you can change it when you know better. So the reason for this is that when you standardize information, it will geotag places that you put in there to these historical places or current places. So it links to the historic locations to a current place on the map, and the records are linked to the geotags. So if I'm looking for records in Cornwall, England, by putting it in there as Cornwall, England, maybe I'm looking at a place called Toanak, but it's actually going to start looking all over Cornwall, not just in that one place, because it understands that it's a place. If I don't have it standardized, or if there is no standard, then it's relying on a keyword versus location. At least I know that's how it works in Ancestry. I'm not sure. I assume that probably is the same thing. And so I want it to know that the records I'm interested in are in this particular place. For example, our Family History Center is here in Granite. And so if I put in Granite, Utah, actually it's a Granite Family History Center. It's not really in Granite, but I can look for it if that's what I thought it was, is Granite. But I can also, it will look in Sandy, it will look in West Jordan, it'll even look in for Brighton. Okay, so it starts to look in all these different places and in Salt Lake. But then it will also start to look in all of Utah and the Western United States. And that's what I want, is that locality. I want it to search the databases, moving out from where I'm at to the place where you can find how FamilySearch puts in these dates places is in the research places. And I put the address at the top. It's familysearch.org/research/places. And this is a little bit older slide. I went in and actually added a lot more detail. And you can also suggest additions if you know things that should be added that aren't. They have not included everything that ever existed in all time, but you can help them with that. And I'm going to show you how I standardize. So, for example, if you look at this record, you can see it's Duval, Florida, United States, and there is a standardized place. But notice that there's two fields. It's showing up as two separate entries. So FamilySearch uses the standardized place to do its searching from, and it's interpreting what you have typed in. But I have found that I have a lot more success if it just doesn't just look the same, but if it is the same, which means that because it's showing up as two different fields, it means there's a space or something in there that says, yeah, these mean the same things, but they're not exactly identical. And so if I click on just in this white space, anywhere in the white space, and I press the space bar, it will bring up this drop-down list, and I can select from that. And I will look at the date to see what the date of the event was, and then I can choose. If it was before 1845, it would have been a territory, but if it's after 1845, it's a county. And so because the date was 1860, this would be a county, and I would choose that one. Now, to be honest, it probably doesn't matter. The computer still puts it in the same place. It says this location is in the exact same place as far as searching records. But if you want it to be exactly correct, then I try to make it as correct as I can. So use this in regards to birth, christening, and death are the places where the times we use this the most, which deals with dates, places, and reasons. So I've decided that there's a way to look at this. There's good, better, and best. So this is a good, good, because we've got a date here. You can see we have the 26th of May, and the computer interpreted it as 26th of May. That's great. You can see this one is uppercase, this is lowercase. So while it interpreted it correctly, they're not identical. They're equivalent, but not equal to the standardized date. And in this case, here you have Philac, Cornwall, England, but it doesn't have a standardized place. And this really needs to be in here. And the fact that it is in there means that I can go and change it, so that's good. But it's not going to start looking for records in Cornwall, England until there's a standardized place. This is what it would be better. So even if I leave this as two separate entries, as what it's interpreted, they're not equal. But the computer is still looking the right date, time period, and now it's looking for the standardized place. But what I have found is using what's best is notice that these two have now been collapsed. These are now equal. They are the exact same thing. I pressed the space bar and chose from the drop-down list, and now it's the same one. And you can tell when they're using the standardized because it has this little calendar next to it. Same thing with place of christening. I pressed in the space bar after England, chose from the drop-down list, and now they are one and the same. So while this is okay, and this is better, this is best. And this is what I try to do with every record that I touched. I want the best options in my records so that the computer does its best work searching. So let's go back to Isabella. In this case here, her birth date was a little interesting because she has 3rd of April, 1854. You can see that these are both standardized, but in my notes, I made a note that the date of birth on her headstone is 3rd of April, 1854, but the Florida death record is the 2nd of April as her birth date. And so there's a discrepancy. So I always want to go look at the records and say, well, why is there a discrepancy between this? I can see that this is for Mrs. Isabella Hart. It's not all spelled out, but it's definitely her because I can see. And then there's the date of birth that was listed, April 2nd, 1854. And I can always look at the informant because the informant probably gave them that information. And I know that sometimes they give the wrong information. A death certificate is not the primary source for her birth, but it should be accurate for her death. And I can see that John Peter Hart is listed as her spouse, so that part is correct. But the birth date is not, it's just informational on death certificate. It's not exact or required to be exact. When I go look at the headstone for Isabella Ince, you can see that they put in April 3rd, 1854. And knowing this family and how diligent they are on genealogy, they were pretty careful to make sure that they put in the exact and correct birth date. So I chose that as the date that would be used in FamilySearch. And in this case, you can see here. So just to show you how this works in practice, this one's already done, but if I click in the white space after the date, right, and I just press the space bar, you can see the drop-down list, and obviously it's still, there's only one there, and I choose that, and then that changes. If it had been different, it'll change that. The same thing for the location. Sometimes it's helpful to just Google a place in Google, go outside of FamilySearch and Google it to get the correct spelling. Because if you have, I come across a lot of things that are spelled a little bit incorrectly, and so they don't, it doesn't come up in the drop-down list, but if I spell it correctly, it does. And then I put in some sort of reason statement if I'm going to do that. Here's Isabella's son, Daniel Christopher Hart, and see in his case, he has a death date and a burial place, but it doesn't actually have the death place. So that may be something that I want to go look into. I want to actually figure out where did he die. I want everybody to have their name, birth date, death places all filled in. But I know now that they actually have standardized a lot of the cemeteries. So if I go down and look in other information, I can see that somebody has added the actual cemetery. So I'm going to take that information and go back up to his burial location, and I'm going to put in the cemetery. Now watch what happens as I start typing it in. It brings up that cemetery, but as I kept typing, it actually removed it. So I kind of pay attention to what's happening below. I'm not sure why that happens, but it does happen quite a bit. But now, as soon as I chose from the drop-down list, it replaced what was typed up in here. And now you can see that they are one and the same. There's not two separate fields for that information of what was there. Where this is really helpful is when we talk about standardizing and timelines, because the timelines tell us, or can be really helpful in our research, and it's based on what is standardized. So if I click on the timeline up there, okay, so I click on the timeline, it takes me into this other option, and you can decide what you want to see. You can choose the events that you want to see on the timeline. You can turn the map on or off. I always like to. And then you can click on these events down below to see where they took place. Now, if you see something that's really out of the way, you might want to go correct it. The reason why this is here is it just says Florida. And so because it's Florida, it just kind of plots it down in the middle of the place. So if everybody else was born in a different place, I might be able to figure out that she might have also been born in Orange or some other place closer to where other realistic. I now actually take out a lot of like the precincts and just put in the actual location as well. So this is really a great way to see where the family is moving and where there might be places that I could spend a little bit more time standardizing and follow where they live. I really love this map feature and I use it quite a bit. The other thing is you can see show a route, especially if they've traveled around a lot. You can see where they've moved from place to place, especially if they've come across. Now, if you see people that are in England one day and then the next day they're in the United States and then the next year they're in a different country, then that may give you a reason to go back and look and say, well, are those really correct? Did they really travel that much? And then they may have, but just to check on that. So I just want to show a few examples of other people and changing that vital information and how it can help. So here's a woman named Lenora Hart. You can see that it brings up some data problems and said, hey, there might be some duplicates. And I can see that she has a middle initial of B, and this one has a middle initial. But the first thing I always do is go in and standardize. So I'm going to click in right after the date. I'm going to press the space bar, bring down the drop-down list so I can change that easily. We have Florida listed. I'm going to use the drop-down list again, and I'm going to select United States. Now, just by clicking on the list, I can change that information, and I don't even have to type. Now, I used to type in standardize, and I've learned since then that they don't like that change log to be used for that. So I don't even put, if I standardize, I don't even put anything anymore. I simply just put, I just leave it blank unless I can put in a reason why I believe that is Florida. Now, here are the record hints that show up, and you can also see research suggestions there that they may have children. But those record hints can be very helpful, and I will go and add and attach those records, and then I want to update any of that information. I can see that Leonora Bell did marry a William C. Tanner, and if I look down here, I can see she's married to a William Cleveland Tanner, so that's a good record for them. I want to go attach those records and update any of that information, and you can see that her birth year is actually the same birth year as we have listed. So everything is very consistent. I can go in and change her name. Now, I was looking at it like a lot of times I cut and paste, but when I looked over here, I noticed that, well, actually, none of the records actually supported Leonora. It was all Lenora. So unless I found something different, I'm not going to change that. I'm going to add it. So that's just one way that I go in. Every time I find more information, I go update the vital fields. In this case here, I now have found a death record for her, and so I can put almost any reason statement. A lot of times I like to put what was indexed into the reason statement so that it shows up in the research or the change log. So if somebody is coming along after me, they will associate Lenora Bell Tanner with the birth date and the death date. Those are very specific to her, and so I can update that. I also click save. And so then after I've made those changes, I go click on person because I can't change it from here. So see how it says September 7th, 1896. It doesn't allow me to add the 7 to her birth here. I actually have to go back and make that change within the field. And so here, you'll see I'll go into edit, and now I'm going to add 7 because that's the actual date. And I didn't redo this video, but now they actually add the information over here so you can see, say under the actual record of her death index, it would say 7 September 1896, which I love that. That's a great thing. So I do have a little quiz that I like to show at the end here. I have, this is an actual record that I came across, and it shows a female who was born, and you can see they put B as for birth. There's no spaces in between here, and these aren't spelled out. So that's the first one. And then you can see why that might be a problem there. And then the same thing in the christening that you don't have C. But also what I would look at is the christening date is most often not on the same date as the birth unless the child was going to die that day. So I usually will change before the birth is before 3rd of December 1820, just to differentiate between those two. But that's what you'll come across a lot. Here's another one. I was working with somebody. We came across a record here, and you can see it says a Mrs. Margaret Pincock. Well, that's not her birth name, and that she's probably born in England, and she was buried on the 30th of January 1888, probably in England. And my thought is, well, if she was buried on a date and it was a specific date, there's probably a record for that date, and I want to find it. So the first thing I do is I'm going to take it, Margaret, and put her back to her maiden name, which is just Margaret, because I don't know her maiden surname. And that she was buried on the 30th of January 1888, and I'm going to look for a record in England of a Margaret Hincock who was buried on that day. And I actually do find a record in the England and Wales Death Registration Index that says that she died on that quarter. So she could have died anytime between December of 1887 to March of 1888, and that was the district and how old she was. And so that gives me a birth year, and that's really helpful. So I take that information and I start to fill in these fields and change the information to reflect what's in there. And now, this is what it was when I first found the record. This is how it was after I made those first initial changes. Here's the record showing the information that I found. And here's the information that I added because of that record. And then I also, because I knew that that was her married name, I gave her a husband named Hincock, and I normally I would actually put before 1803 at this point, but before 1805. So now I can start looking for perhaps a marriage record in maybe this Lancashire, England, and see if that's where they lived. And that's how I can use those pieces of information by updating them. So in review, I would say that the most important things are just to standardize the names, dates, and places to the correct format. Be sure to add and attach the sources that come up as hints if they're correct, and then add, update, and correct, and standardize the data fields from the sources. Now, always look for records that support the information, and then tag the sources for those data fields. And then you want to standardize the information for better source hints, duplicates, and geotagging. And then my goal always is for complete, accurate, standardized, and sources for each person. And for the whole purpose of completed ordinances for every person. So that's always my goal when I get to any person that I'm working on. I want everything to be as complete and accurate. And I think that really goes along with the scripture, which is my favorite one when I'm working in genealogy and working on this. And sometimes as I hesitate, maybe I don't want to put it into it. No, I do, because in Doctrine and Covenants 128:24, it says, "Let us therefore as a church and a people, and as Latter-day Saints, offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness, and let us present in this holy temple, when it is finished, a book containing the records of our dead, which shall be worthy of all acceptance." And I love that scripture. It's something that I'm reminded of when I work on any person. I want them to be a complete person. I want them to be found, and I want their work to be done for them. And I know that they're waiting for that. These are the sources that I recommend that you can use. And copy, paste, or whatever. I'm not sure how to do it on here, but can go to any of these places. These are the ones that I really think talk about standardizing and entering information really well. And so that's my presentation. And I think we've got that. Oh, so let's see. Are we good?
We are good. Debbie, right. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is
sounds like looking at my card. Yep. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.